Jimmy, you had mentioned to me that many sites were thrust into DCTs quicker than they were able to adjust to them. And one of the problems was costs, which I think, and I think you'll agree, were not likely fully understood when this first started to take place. So what was the main issue that sites were facing?
Absolutely. As Carrie and Brad mentioned, right, there is a lot of firsts that came along with this journey into decentralized clinical trials, and the rapid pace at which these firsts came about for the sites was really the root of a lot of the problem. The sites didn't understand, and still to a large extent don't understand, how to appropriately cost the things that they don't know about, right? These things are coming down to them right before the protocols are being executed and patients are expected to be screened into the clinical trials. So they're scrambling to understand what all are the elements of a given trial. Brad and Carrie mentioned many of them that are going to be required of that specific trial, and which ones are not, so which ones are going to be done in traditional methods. So really gathering that information and being able to understand and accurately apply their costing procedures to them is really a lot of what the challenge is. They're not getting this information from the sponsors and CROs early enough, or they're simply not getting it until the procedure or particular element is being required of them.
And Carrie, when we first connected, you also mentioned cost difficulties, and we've already mentioned that today. But one of the challenges is that I believe there's a lot of new costs to sites that did not exist in the past with traditional trial models. Can you kind of walk us through what some of those new costs are and how you feel they're impacting sites?
Sure, and obviously your poll question alludes to a lot of these costs. IT infrastructure, in order to improve cybersecurity, insurance, you need to maybe purchase new laptops, upgrade the laptops and systems that are deployed. The paperless system alone was an incredible cost that we have basically brought onto a site, because you're paying for an electronic doc system, electronic source, and that becomes cost. There's e-consent capabilities, which all bring cost to the site. There's also just the people costs, the fact that I have more workload for the coordinators, so less time to see the patient visits. Ultimately, that increased costs. I would say that's probably one of the largest costs where I answered my question there. Beyond the tech, once you commit to the infrastructure, it really is continued people costs that we're managing. Turnover, I mean, we get turnover. Obviously, there's a lot of discussions. We can go into a whole presentation on turnover, but there's a perceived notion that with all this complexity creep that we've added, the burden on a coordinator is substantial these days. And so going maybe to the other side is easier. There is that perception. So we have to certainly, as sites, think about the positions and the support mechanisms that we need to put in place to reduce that burden or that perceived burden. So, the fact that I now hire study administrators, that's a new position. I have to have someone that is more tech savvy. That's a higher cost of an employee that I'm hiring. So all of these things just mount into increased costs from a site perspective.
And Leanne just asked, how could sponsors have streamlined the training to make it easier for sites? Is there anything that you think they could have done or done more of to relieve that burden on you guys and just made the transition a bit easier?
I think part of it is the challenge was if we're talking about vendors, a lot of the new vendors came to be, a lot of them are new to research. And so then they had their own training programs, which were on top of what the sponsor would do from a training program. So that would be one additional way that it was just an increased load of work. And then who really needs to do that training? A lot of times the sponsor looks at every staff has to do everything. And I think we have to be, if we're now at a site looking at positions and specific job duties related to a position, then we need to roll out training that's most appropriate for that particular position. So a sponsor, again, and a CRO has to rethink their SOPs that were based on traditional models and change them and roll out processes associated with that.
And just one final question, and I want to put up the second poll question. But when it came to implementing new technologies and the cost of that, the infrastructure and so forth, do you generally see sites getting any help with that from sponsor companies, or is that, again, something that they've been left to try and figure out for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, in sites in general, there's, again, support system, SCRS is one of them. There's great discussion boards that happen on what we're doing. So there was definitely, like if you take PPE as an example, there was an immediate request for PPE support during the height of COVID as one kind of immediate cost increase. But if you're talking about the IT infrastructure, there is a pass-through potential cost that we're negotiating in every contract for the systems that are being deployed. So if a monitor now doesn't have to travel to the site, that's a cost savings. If I have to deploy a system that allows remote access at any time, then maybe there's some cost sharing in that concept. So that's something that we're submitting. And I would say in general, just an overhead increase. I mean, you see even inflation increase just as a general, we're having to increase the salaries. A lot of that is to support the retention of our staff, to manage the inflation. So the overhead is probably the easiest place that we've been able to get some support from the sponsors and CROs.